April 28, 1944. 2:17 a.m. The English Channel was cold enough to kill a man in 20 minutes. The water, black as crude oil beneath a moonless sky, carried the bite of late winter that spring had not yet softened. Waves slapped against steel hulls with the rhythmic persistence of a metronome counting down to something violent. In the darkness off the coast of Normandy, where fog rolled in thick layers that turned visibility into guesswork, the destroyer HMS Opportune cut through the water at 28 knots, her bow throwing spray that froze on the faces of lookouts before it could drip from their chins. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, mixed with the acrid bite of cordite from guns that had been firing intermittently for the past 3 hours. Below decks, in the crew's mess where men caught sleep in 5-minute intervals between action stations, 36 white ceramic coffee mugs sat in their racks, each bearing the ship's crest, a black eagle clutching an anchor, each waiting to become something they were never designed to be. Lieutenant Commander John Lee stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the rail with enough force to leave impressions in his palms. Through the darkness, his radar operator had detected a contact moving northeast at high speed. Range, 4,000 yards. Classification, uncertain, but the speed profile matched German E-boats, the fast attack craft that had been harassing Allied convoy routes for months, appearing from the French coast like wolves from a tree line, striking with torpedoes and vanishing before escorts could respond. Lee had been hunting them for 6 weeks. Tonight, finally, the hunt was about to end. What neither he nor his crew could know was that in 17 minutes, HMS Opportune would do something that destroyer doctrine explicitly prohibited, something that would violate every principle of naval engagement taught at Dartmouth, something so reckless that court-martial seemed more likely than commendation. She would ram an enemy vessel at full speed, and her crew would board it with whatever weapons they could find, including coffee mugs. To understand what happened in those dark waters requires understanding the nature of the E-boat threat and why it had become a tactical nightmare for Allied planners in the months before D-Day. The German Schnellboot, designated E-boat by British intelligence, the E, standing for enemy, was a fast attack craft displacing roughly 100 tons, capable of speeds exceeding 40 knots, armed with 2 torpedo tubes and automatic cannons. They operated from French Channel ports, launching night raids against Allied shipping with hit-and-run tactics that exploited their speed advantage and intimate knowledge of coastal waters. They were too fast for conventional destroyers to catch, too maneuverable for bombers to target effectively, and too numerous to ignore. By April 1944, E-boats had sunk over 100,000 tons of Allied shipping. More importantly, they had created an atmosphere of uncertainty in the Channel approaches, forcing convoys to travel with heavy escorts, disrupting training exercises for the coming invasion, and tying down resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The British Admiralty had designated E-boat suppression as a priority mission, assigning destroyer flotillas to patrol the Channel approaches and engage the German craft whenever possible. But engagement was the problem. E-boats attacked at night, in fog, using shore batteries and minefields as protective barriers. They carried no armor to speak of, their defense was speed and stealth. Destroyer doctrine called for long-range engagement with main battery fire, using radar to establish firing solutions while keeping distance. The theory was sound. The practice was frustratingly ineffective. E-boats were small, fast-moving targets that appeared on radar as intermittent contacts easily lost in sea clutter. By the time a destroyer established a proper firing solution, the E-boats had often launched their torpedoes and were already withdrawing. HMS Opportune had been patrolling these waters since February. Her crew had developed a deep, personal hatred for E-boats, the kind that grows from repeated near misses, from watching merchant ships explode in the night, from the grinding frustration of an enemy that struck and vanished like smoke. They had been trained to fight submarines and surface vessels in proper gunnery engagements. Instead, they were engaged in a knife fight in a dark room, chasing targets that refused to stand and fight. Lieutenant Commander Lee had concluded that doctrine was failing. And tonight, he was going to try something else. The radar contact resolved into visual confirmation at 2:23 a.m. 3 E-boats running in formation, their low profiles barely visible against the dark water, heading northeast toward the French coast at 35 knots. They had been conducting a raid on a coastal convoy and were now withdrawing, likely confident they had avoided detection. Opportune's lookouts spotted them at 1,200 yards, dark shapes against darker water, identified by the distinctive phosphorescent wakes their high speeds created in the plankton-rich channel waters. Lee ordered full speed ahead and a course to intercept. The E-boats detected Opportune immediately. Their commanders, experienced officers who had survived months of channel warfare, responded with standard evasion tactics, splitting formation, each boat turning on different headings to divide the destroyer's fire, preparing to launch torpedoes if the British ship got close enough to threaten them. The lead E-boat, S-130, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Werner, turned hard to port and increased speed, intending to draw Opportune away from his wingmen while they escaped to the northeast. It was a tactic that had worked dozens of times before. But Lee didn't order his main battery to open fire. He didn't establish a firing solution and engage at maximum effective range. Instead, he did something that made his executive officer question whether the captain had lost his mind. He turned Opportune directly toward S-130 and maintained full speed. The German E-boat commander realized what was happening too late. The destroyer wasn't trying to shoot them. She was trying to ram them. At a combined closing speed of over 60 knots, with visibility less than 500 yards, Werner had perhaps 30 seconds to respond. He threw S-130 into a hard turn, her rudder over full, her engines straining to accelerate out of the destroyer's path. But destroyers, despite their size, could turn faster than most people realized. Lee had trained his helmsmen for exactly this scenario, not in any official exercise, but in drills he designed himself during weeks of frustration. He made them practice turning circles, acceleration curves, relative motion problems at speeds that made the ship shudder and sent loose equipment sliding across decks. Opportune turned inside the S-130's evasion curve. At 2:26 a.m., traveling at 29 knots, HMS Opportune's reinforced bow struck S-130 amidships with a sound like a cathedral bell struck with a sledgehammer, a deep, resonant crash that could be heard for miles across the water. The impact crushed the E-boat's wooden hull like cardboard, snapping her keel and folding her structure inward. The German craft's forward momentum was arrested so violently that men were thrown from their stations, equipment ripped from mountings, and the port torpedo tube was torn completely free and thrown into the water. But S-130 didn't sink immediately. The impact had wedged her against Opportune's hull, held in place by the destroyer's momentum and the twisted metal that had interlocked the two vessels. For a moment, perhaps 5 seconds, the two ships were locked together, the destroyer pushing the smaller craft through the water like a whale carrying a lamprey. And in that moment, something happened that no tactical manual had ever addressed. The crews saw each other. The distance between Opportune's deck and S-130's shattered hull was less than 6 feet. Close enough to see faces. Close enough to hear voices. Close enough to smell the diesel fuel that was already pouring from the E-boat's ruptured tanks. German sailors were scrambling on the tilted deck, some trying to reach life jackets, others frozen in shock. British sailors were lining the rail, equally stunned, staring at an enemy they'd been hunting for months but had never seen this close. For a moment, both crews simply stared. Then someone on Opportune's deck threw a coffee mug. It was not a strategic decision. It was not ordered by any officer. A sailor named Thomas Wickham, a mess steward who had been carrying a tray of mugs to the galley when action stations had been called, hurled one of the ceramic vessels at a German sailor who appeared to be reaching for a weapon. The mug struck the German in the shoulder, hardly a devastating blow, but the psychological effect was immediate. It broke the spell of shock. It transformed the moment from frozen tableau into active combat. And then everyone started throwing things. Coffee mugs? Wrenches. Coils of rope. A toolbox. Whatever wasn't bolted down became a projectile. The German sailors responded in kind, hurling back whatever they could grab. For perhaps 20 seconds, the engagement devolved into something more resembling a pub brawl than naval combat. Two ships locked together, their crews pelting each other with improvised weapons at point-blank range while the destroyer continued pushing the E-boat through the water. Then S-130 began to break apart. The structural damage from the ramming was catastrophic. The E-boat's wooden hull, designed for speed rather than strength, was never intended to absorb the impact of a 1,600-ton destroyer. The keel was broken in 2 places. The frames were splintered. As Opportune continued forward, the E-boat's hull began to fold around the point of impact, water flooding into every compartment with a speed that left no time for organized evacuation. German sailors began jumping into the water. Some were pulled under immediately by the suction of the sinking boat. Others managed to surface, gasping in the frigid water, their hands already going numb from the cold. Lieutenant Commander Lee ordered engines full astern, trying to disengage before Opportune became entangled in the sinking wreckage. The destroyer shuddered as her propellers reversed, pulling away from S-130 with a grinding screech of metal on metal. The E-boat fell away, listing heavily to starboard, her deck already awash. She would sink in less than 3 minutes. But the engagement was not over. 36 German sailors were in the water, and British doctrine required that survivors be recovered for interrogation. Lee ordered boats to be lowered and rescue operations to begin, even as his radar operator reported that the other 2 E-boats had reversed course and were heading back toward the collision site, likely to rescue their own crew, possibly to attack the British destroyer while she was occupied with rescue operations. What followed was a scene of surreal juxtaposition. British sailors hauling German sailors from the water while preparing for possible renewed combat, enemy combatants becoming prisoners in the span of seconds, men who had been trying to kill each other moments before now working together to avoid drowning in water cold enough to kill in minutes. And through it all, floating on the surface among the oil and debris, were 36 white ceramic coffee mugs bearing the crest of HMS Opportune, scattered across the water like strange markers of one of the most unusual naval engagements of the war. The German sailors pulled from the water that night were young, most in their early 20s, some barely 19. They had been indoctrinated in the narrative of German naval superiority, trained in tactics that emphasized speed and surprise, told that British destroyers were slow, predictable, easily evaded. They had been confident in their vessels, confident in their commanders, confident that the Channel approaches were their domain where they could strike with impunity. The ramming had shattered that confidence completely. Captain Lieutenant Werner, one of the survivors, would later be interrogated at a British prisoner of war facility. The interrogation transcript, declassified in 1974, provides remarkable insight into the psychological impact of the engagement. When asked to describe what had happened, Werner's response was recorded as follows. "We did not believe it was possible. Destroyers do not ram E-boats. The speed differential, the risk to their own hull integrity, the doctrine, everything said they would engage at range with gunfire. When we saw Opportune turn toward us, we thought it was a navigation error. We thought they had lost sight of us in the darkness, and were turning onto a search pattern. Then we realized they were accelerating. Even then, we could not accept what we were seeing. It was not until the moment of impact that we understood. The British commander had decided to destroy us even if it meant destroying his own ship. This was not tactics. This was rage." Werner was correct about the emotional component, but he misunderstood its nature. It was not rage that drove Lee's decision. It was calculation, the cold, rational assessment that conventional tactics were failing, that E-boats could not be effectively engaged with long-range gunfire, and that the only way to guarantee a kill was to remove the enemy's primary advantage, speed and maneuverability. Ramming accomplished both objectives. It was dangerous, unorthodox, and potentially catastrophic for the attacking vessel. But it worked. And it sent a message that resonated through German E-boat operations for the remainder of the war, that British destroyers were no longer bound by predictable doctrine, that they were willing to engage in close-quarters combat with tactics that seemed suicidal, that the Channel approaches were no longer a safe hunting ground. The damage to HMS Opportune was severe but not fatal. Her bow was crushed inward for a length of 12 feet, multiple plates were buckled, and her forward compartments were taking on water at a rate that required continuous pumping. But her structural integrity held. Her engines remained operational. She was able to return to Portsmouth under her own power, though at reduced speed and with her crew manning damage control stations for the entire 8-hour transit. The Admiralty's response to Lee's action was conflicted. On one hand, he had violated standing orders regarding engagement protocols. Ramming was considered a last resort tactic, to be used only when a vessel was about to be torpedoed or in situations where conventional weapons had failed. Lee had rammed as a first option, not a last resort. Some senior officers called for disciplinary action. On the other hand, he had sunk an E-boat, a task that had eluded destroyer crews for months, and had captured 36 German sailors who provided valuable intelligence about E-boat operations, base locations, and planned future raids. The intelligence gathered from these prisoners contributed to several successful Allied operations in the weeks before D-Day. In the end, Lee received a formal reprimand for violating doctrine, along with an informal commendation from the destroyer flotilla commander who noted in a private letter, "Lee's tactics were unorthodox and potentially reckless. They were also effective. In warfare, we should perhaps place greater emphasis on the latter quality." But the most significant impact of the engagement was not strategic or tactical. It was psychological. The story of HMS Opportune ramming S-130 spread through both Allied and German naval forces with remarkable speed. Among British destroyer crews, it became a legend, proof that E-boats could be caught and killed, that aggressive tactics could overcome technical limitations, that doctrine was a guideline rather than sacred text. Morale among Channel Patrol vessels increased noticeably. Commanders began experimenting with close-range engagement tactics. E-boat kill rates improved. Among German E-boat crews, the story had the opposite effect. They had operated with the confidence of predators who controlled their hunting ground. The ramming demonstrated that they were vulnerable in ways they had not anticipated, that British destroyers were willing to sacrifice their own safety to guarantee kills, that the risk calculation had fundamentally changed. E-boat operations became more cautious. Withdrawal speeds increased. Raids were shortened. Some crews requested transfers to other assignments. The psychological transformation was measured in engagement statistics. In the 3 months before April 1944, E-boats had sunk an average of 8,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. In the 3 months after, that average dropped to less than 3,000 tons. Not all of this decline can be attributed to the Opportune incident. Allied air patrols increased, radar improvements were implemented, additional destroyer flotillas were assigned to Channel Patrol. But the timing suggests that the ramming played a significant role in degrading German operational confidence. And there was the matter of the coffee mugs. 36 ceramic mugs, scattered across the surface of the English Channel, became an unlikely symbol of the engagement. Several were recovered by British sailors during rescue operations. One was retrieved by a German survivor who kept it throughout his captivity and, after the war, donated it to a British naval museum with a note explaining its significance. The mug sits in a display case now, its white ceramic surface stained with decades of age but still bearing the clearly visible crest of HMS Opportune, alongside a placard explaining its role in one of the war's most unusual close-quarters naval engagements. The symbolism was not lost on those who knew the story. Coffee, particularly the strong, hot coffee that sustained watch crews through long night patrols, represented the mundane reality of naval service. It was comfortable. Routine. The small rituals that made ship life bearable. That such ordinary objects became weapons in a moment of desperate improvisation spoke to something fundamental about the nature of close combat. When doctrine fails and weapons are insufficient, men fight with whatever they can reach. But the coffee mugs represented something else, too, something that German prisoners remarked upon during interrogation, something that appeared in multiple debriefing reports with a consistency that suggests it was genuinely significant. They represented abundance. The German sailors pulled from the water that night were struck by details that British crews took for granted. They commented on the quality of the coffee mugs themselves, heavy ceramic rather than the tin cups used on E-boats. They commented on the fact that there were enough mugs to throw dozens overboard without apparent concern for replacing them. They commented on the food they were given after rescue, real bread, fresh butter, hot soup, at a point in the war when German rations had deteriorated to the point where frontline units were subsisting on black bread and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. One prisoner, a mechanic named Klaus Hoffmann, made an observation that was recorded in his interrogation file. "We were told that Britain was starving, that the U-boat blockade had reduced you to desperation. But the sailors who pulled me from the water, who saved my life, were well fed. They gave us real coffee. They had so many cups they could throw them at us and not care. If this is how you treat prisoners in 1944, how do you treat your own people? We were told you were losing. But you do not look like a loser." This observation appears, in various forms, in multiple interrogation transcripts. The material abundance visible even on a working destroyer, the quality of equipment, the condition of uniforms, the food available to ordinary sailors, contradicted the narrative German forces had been fed about British decline and desperation. The coffee mugs became a synecdoche for a larger reality, that the Allied industrial base was not only intact but producing at levels that allowed frontline forces to maintain standards of living that Germany could no longer match. This was not intentional psychological warfare. British sailors were not throwing coffee mugs as a demonstration of material superiority. They were throwing them because those were the objects at hand in a moment of desperate improvisation. But the effect was the same. German prisoners confronted, in visceral and immediate terms, evidence that their leadership had been lying to them about the strategic situation. Some prisoners dismissed this as propaganda, as an elaborate show staged for their benefit. But others, particularly those who remained in British captivity long enough to observe the daily operations of POW camps, began to recognize patterns. The food was consistently good. The facilities were maintained. Red Cross packages arrived on schedule. British guards were well equipped, well fed, showing none of the desperation that would characterize a nation on the brink of collapse. The coffee mugs of HMS Opportune became, in a small but meaningful way, a crack in the edifice of German wartime propaganda, physical evidence that contradicted the narrative of inevitable victory over a starving, demoralized enemy. Lieutenant Commander Lee never fully embraced his role as the captain who rammed an E-boat with a destroyer. In the months after the incident, as the story spread and became embellished with retelling, he grew increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. In a letter to his wife, written in June 1944, he expressed ambivalence about the engagement. "The newspapers make it sound glorious, but the truth is I was simply out of options. We had been chasing these boats for weeks with no success. Conventional tactics were failing. I made a decision in the moment that could have killed my entire crew if Opportune's hull had buckled on impact. That it worked does not make it wise, only fortunate. I do not recommend that others attempt the same. But I also cannot say I regret it. We won. They lost. In war, perhaps that is the only metric that matters." Lee's uncertainty reflected a broader tension within military doctrine, the balance between adherence to tested procedures and the necessity of adaptation in the face of failure. Ramming was not standard procedure because it was dangerous and unpredictable. But when standard procedures consistently failed to achieve objectives, the question became whether maintaining doctrine was more important than achieving results. The engagement off the French coast in April 1944 suggested an answer. Doctrine should serve victory, not the reverse. When circumstances demand adaptation, successful commanders adapt. When conventional weapons prove insufficient, improvised weapons become standard. When the enemy expects certain behaviors, violating those expectations creates advantage. These are not lessons that can be easily codified into training manuals. They require judgment, initiative, and willingness to accept risk. They require commanders who understand that rules exist to guide decision-making, not replace it. Lee demonstrated those qualities in a moment of decision that lasted less than 30 seconds, the window between detecting S-130's evasion maneuver and ordering Opportune to turn inside it. In that window, he assessed options, calculated probabilities, accepted risks, and gave orders that resulted in one of the war's most unusual naval victories. And in doing so, he validated something that every combat veteran understands but that few military institutions acknowledge, that in the chaos of actual combat, the difference between success and failure often comes down to the willingness to do something doctrine explicitly prohibits. HMS Opportune survived the war. She was repaired after the ramming incident and returned to service, participating in D-Day support operations, anti-submarine patrols, and convoy escort duties through V-Day. She was decommissioned in 1955 and scrapped 2 years later. None of her physical structure survives, but her legacy lives on in naval museums, in declassified action reports, and in the memories of the men who served aboard her. The German E-boat S-130 lies in 70 meters of water off the French coast, her broken hull now encrusted with marine growth, a habitat for fish and crustaceans who care nothing for the human drama that sent her to the bottom. Recreational divers occasionally visit the wreck, photographing the twisted metal and speculating about what happened. Few know the full story. Fewer still know about the coffee mugs. Lieutenant Commander John Lee retired from the Royal Navy in 1958 with the rank of commander. He died in 1982, having rarely spoken publicly about the war. His personal papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum, include detailed notes about the ramming incident, written years later with the perspective of distance and reflection. In those notes, he returns repeatedly to a single question: what made him decide to ram rather than follow doctrine? His answer, written in careful longhand on pages yellowed with age, is revealing. I think what changed was not my tactical assessment but my emotional relationship with the enemy. For months, we chased E-boats without success. They struck and vanished. They killed merchant sailors and disappeared. They made us feel impotent. Somewhere in those months of frustration, I stopped thinking of them as tactical problems to be solved and started thinking of them as prey to be caught. When I saw S-130 that night, I did not calculate firing solutions or consider optimal engagement ranges. I simply thought, you will not escape again. And I acted on that thought without hesitation. Doctrine came second. Instinct came first. Perhaps that makes me a poor naval officer. But it made me, for that moment, an effective hunter. This admission is remarkable for its honesty. Lee recognized that his decision was driven not by rational calculation but by accumulated frustration, by the emotional need to finally catch an enemy that had eluded him for months. The ramming was strategic only in retrospect. In the moment, it was personal. But this does not diminish its effectiveness. Some of the most successful military actions in history have been driven by commanders who allowed emotion to inform tactics, who understood that killing the enemy was not an abstract problem to be solved with mathematical precision, but a visceral necessity that sometimes required abandoning elegant solutions in favor of brutal directness. The ramming of S-130 was brutal. It was direct. And it worked. In the years after the war, as military historians analyzed the Channel Campaign and the preparation for D-Day, the Opportune incident was sometimes cited as an example of tactical innovation under pressure. It appeared in staff college curricula as a case study in adaptation. It was referenced in papers about the psychology of command decision-making. It became, in the dry language of military analysis, a significant engagement demonstrating the effectiveness of unconventional tactics against asymmetric threats. But for the men who were there, both British and German, it remained something more visceral and immediate than any academic analysis could capture. It remained the moment when two ships collided in darkness, when professional naval combat devolved into throwing whatever was at hand, when the distance between victor and vanquished was measured in seconds and the span of a destroyer's deck. It remained, most of all, a reminder that war is not conducted by institutions or doctrines or strategic plans. It is conducted by individual human beings making decisions in moments of extremity, decisions that can seem rational or insane depending on outcome, decisions that are forgotten if they fail and celebrated if they succeed. Lee's decision succeeded. S-130 sank. 36 prisoners were taken. Intelligence was gathered. The tactical situation in the Channel improved. By any objective metric, the ramming was a success. But success, as Lee understood, was also a matter of fortune. If Opportune's bow had buckled on impact, if the destroyer had taken on water faster than pumps could manage, if the other U-boats had pressed an attack while Opportune was conducting rescue operations, any of these possibilities could have transformed tactical innovation into catastrophe. The line between brilliance and recklessness, in combat, is drawn by outcome rather than intention. The coffee mugs remain the most enduring symbol of the engagement, preserved in museum displays, mentioned in documentary narration, referenced in naval histories. They represent the unexpected and improvised nature of close combat, the way ordinary objects become extraordinary weapons, the human impulse to fight with whatever tools are available. But they also represent something that the German prisoners recognized and that Allied sailors took for granted: the material abundance that sustained British forces through years of total war. The ability to produce enough ceramic mugs that throwing 3 dozen overboard represented no significant loss. The logistics network that ensured frontline vessels remained supplied with amenities that German forces increasingly lacked. The industrial capacity that allowed Britain, despite being geographically smaller and less populous than Germany, to maintain standards of equipment and supply that impressed even enemy combatants. This was not accidental. It was the result of strategic decisions made years before, decisions about industrial mobilization, about supply chain management, about prioritizing morale through material support. It was the result of American Lend-Lease aid, which provided resources that Britain's domestic production could not match. It was the result of merchant sailors who died bringing those supplies across submarine-infested waters. The coffee mugs of HMS Opportune represented all of that accumulated effort, all of that strategic preparation, all of that material investment. They were mundane objects that carried immense symbolic weight for those who understood their context. And in the moment when British sailors hurled them at German opponents, those mugs became weapons in a struggle that was about more than tactics or terrain. They became symbols of a fundamental reality: that the Allied cause was sustained by an industrial and logistical foundation that the Axis powers could not match, and that this advantage was visible even in the smallest details of daily military life. The story of HMS Opportune ramming S-130 is not one of the great naval engagements of World War II. It did not change the strategic balance. It did not sink a battleship or protect a vital convoy. It was a small action in a minor theater, involving vessels that most histories barely mention. But it mattered to the men who were there. It mattered to the U-boat crews who became more cautious in their raids. It mattered to the Allied sailors who gained confidence from proof that aggressive tactics could succeed. It mattered to the prisoners who had their assumptions about British weakness contradicted by direct experience. And it matters now as a reminder that war is composed not just of grand strategies and decisive battles but of thousands of small engagements where individual decisions compound into larger effects, where tactical innovation emerges from desperation, where the gap between doctrine and reality is bridged by commanders willing to accept risk. Lieutenant Commander Lee did not set out to become a symbol of anything. He was simply a destroyer captain trying to solve a tactical problem that conventional methods could not address. His solution was unorthodox, dangerous, and effective. It violated doctrine and succeeded anyway. It transformed an impossible tactical situation into a victory measured in 1 sunk E-boat and 36 prisoners. And it left behind, as physical evidence of that victory, 3 dozen white ceramic coffee mugs floating on the surface of the English Channel, bearing the crest of a British destroyer that refused to accept that speed and stealth made an enemy uncatchable. Those mugs, or at least the one that survived, preserved now behind glass in a British museum, remain a testament to the unexpected nature of combat, to the improvisation that necessity demands, to the courage of men who fought with whatever they could reach. They remain a testament to the truth that victory sometimes requires abandoning everything doctrine teaches and trusting instinct instead. And they remain, most enduringly, a testament to the strange alchemy by which ordinary objects become extraordinary symbols, by which mundane details reveal larger truths, by which the simple act of throwing a coffee mug becomes, in the right context, an assertion of material strength and moral determination. The Germans could not believe a destroyer would ram them. Until it did. And then they could not believe that 36 sailors would fight hand-to-hand with coffee mugs. Until they did. And in those moments of disbelief and recognition, something fundamental shifted. the understanding that the war they thought they were fighting, against a weakened, desperate enemy, was not the war they were actually fighting. The real war was against an opponent with resources to spare, with sailors willing to ram rather than retreat, with enough coffee mugs to throw them away and not care. That was the war Germany was losing. And a single destroyer, damaged but triumphant, steaming back to Portsmouth with 36 prisoners and a crushed bow, represented that reality more clearly than any grand strategic assessment ever could.